When the last boarding house door slammed in her face, 8 months pregnant and alone in 1884 Montana, Sarah Fletcher knew she was going to die in the wilderness until a mysterious mountain man emerged from the shadows, about to prove that sometimes salvation comes wrapped in buckskin and carrying secrets darker than her own. What happened next in that isolated cabin during the worst blizzard in decades would transform two broken souls into an unbreakable family. But first, they'd have to survive the vengeful men riding up the mountain to destroy everything they'd built together. Before we dive into the story, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more incredible tales of human resilience tomorrow. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now let's continue with the story. The autumn wind cut through Cedar Ridge like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter and the whispered judgments of decent folk. Sarah Fletcher pulled her worn shawl tighter around her swollen belly as she approached the final boarding house on Main Street. 8 months pregnant and penniless, she'd been turned away from every respectable establishment in town. The weight of their stares followed her like a shadow, each glance a reminder that she carried shame beneath her heart. Mrs. Caldwell answered the door with pursed lips and cold eyes that immediately dropped to Sarah's condition. "We don't have rooms for your kind," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Try the saloon. Maybe they'll take pity on a fallen woman." The door slammed shut with such force that the sound echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. Sarah's legs trembled as she made her way back toward the center of town. She'd walked nearly 15 miles to reach Cedar Ridge, following rumors of work and kindness that now seemed as hollow as her empty stomach. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mother's desperation, and Sarah pressed a gentle hand to her side. "I know, little one," she whispered. "Mama's trying." Outside Morrison's general store, her strength finally gave out. The wooden steps looked inviting, and she sank down onto them, her body too exhausted to care about propriety. Inside, she could hear the murmur of conversation, the comfortable sounds of people conducting normal business, living normal lives. Lives that no longer included space for someone like her. A group of women emerged from the store, their arms full of packages and their voices full of gossip. They noticed Sarah immediately, and their chatter died as if someone had thrown a blanket over a fire. One of them whispered something that made the others gasp and clutch their parcels closer. They stepped carefully around her, as if her condition might be catching, their skirts rustling with disapproval. "Disgraceful," one muttered just loud enough for Sarah to hear, flaunting her sin for all to see. Sarah closed her eyes against the burning shame, but the tears came anyway. She'd endured months of this treatment, ever since her condition became impossible to hide. Her own family had cast her out, her former friends had turned their backs, and the father of her child had vanished like smoke the moment she'd told him the news. Now, as darkness began to creep across the mountains, she faced the terrifying possibility that she might give birth alone in the wilderness, with no one to hear her cries but the wolves. The wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the dusty street and sending a chill deep into her bones. Somewhere in the distance, a horse nickered softly, but Sarah was too lost in her despair to notice the figure watching from the shadows, or the way his weathered hands tightened on his reins as he witnessed the town's cruelty. Ezra Stone had learned long ago that civilization and cruelty often walked hand in hand. From his position in the alley beside the general store, he'd witnessed the whole shameful display. The townspeople's treatment of the pregnant woman stirred something dark and familiar in his chest, a rage he'd thought buried along with his wife and child 3 winters past. He'd ridden into Cedar Ridge for supplies, nothing more, but now he found himself unable to look away from the broken figure huddled on the steps. The woman was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair that caught the dying light despite her obvious exhaustion. Something about the way she held herself, even in defeat, reminded him painfully of Mary. His late wife had possessed that same quiet dignity, that stubborn refusal to let the world's harshness completely break her spirit. When the pregnant woman finally rose on unsteady legs and began walking toward the edge of town, Ezra made a decision that surprised him. He followed at a distance, his horse's hooves muffled by years of mountain training. The woman moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest against fence posts and trees. She was heading toward Willow Creek, the same waterway that ran past his cabin 5 miles upstream. When she stumbled and nearly fell, Ezra's hands tightened on his reins. When she collapsed entirely, disappearing into the tall grass beside the creek bank, he spurred his horse forward. She was unconscious when he reached her, her breathing shallow and her skin pale as winter moonlight. Her dress was patched and threadbare, speaking of poverty that went deeper than simple misfortune. Ezra knelt beside her, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for injuries. The baby was still moving. He could see the subtle shifts beneath her dress, and he felt an unexpected relief. "Ma'am," he called softly, but she didn't stir. The sun was setting fast, and the mountain nights came cold and quick. Whatever had brought this woman to such desperate circumstances, she wouldn't survive the night exposed to the elements in her condition. Ezra had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of complication. After losing Mary and their son, he'd retreated to his cabin in the high country, where the only voices he heard were the wind through the pines and the call of hunting eagles. He trapped, he hunted, he traded his furs in town once a season, and he asked nothing from anyone. It was a hard life, but it was simple, and simple meant safe from the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him. But as he looked down at the unconscious woman, her hand instinctively curved over her unborn child, even in sleep, Ezra knew he couldn't walk away. Mary would have boxed his ears if he'd left a pregnant woman to die in the wilderness, especially one who'd been treated so cruelly by people who claimed to follow Christian virtues. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was despite her pregnancy. Malnutrition, he realized grimly. When had she last eaten a proper meal? Her head fell against his shoulder as he carried her to his horse, and he caught the faint scent of lavender beneath the dust and exhaustion. Someone had loved her once, cared enough to give her small luxuries like scented soap. Getting her onto his horse while unconscious proved challenging, but Ezra managed to secure her in front of him, one arm wrapped protectively around her waist. The ride to his cabin took nearly an hour, and she stirred only once, murmuring something that sounded like an apology before settling back into unconsciousness. His cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, smoke already rising from the chimney thanks to the banked fire he'd left that morning. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was warm and dry and safe. As he carried the woman inside and settled her on his own bed, covering her with Mary's old quilt, Ezra wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd saved her life, but what happened when she woke up and found herself alone in the wilderness with a strange man? Would she see salvation or a different kind of danger? Sarah woke to the unfamiliar sound of crackling logs and the rich aroma of venison stew. For a moment, she lay still, afraid to open her eyes and discover where she'd ended up. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she'd felt in months, covered with a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something feminine and long-faded. When she finally gathered the courage to look around, she found herself in a simple but well-built cabin, sunlight streaming through windows so clean they might have been polished that very morning. "You're awake." The voice came from the doorway, deep and careful, like its owner was trying not to startle a wild animal. Sarah turned to see a man unlike any she'd encountered in town. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were buckskin and homespun, practical and well-worn, and his hands looked like they'd never known a day without honest work. But it was his expression that caught her attention, a mixture of concern and wariness that suggested he was as uncertain about this situation as she was. "Where am I?" Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat dry as prairie dust. She struggled to sit up, one hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "My cabin, 5 miles upstream from where I found you." The man, Ezra, stepped closer but stopped well short of the bed, as if he understood that proximity might frighten her. "Name's Ezra Stone. You collapsed by Willow Creek yesterday evening." I couldn't leave you there. Yesterday evening. Sarah tried to remember, but everything after leaving the general store felt hazy and dreamlike. I should go, she said, though the thought of facing the wilderness again made her stomach clench with more than hunger. I don't want to be any trouble. Ezra's expression darkened. Go where? Back to those Christian folks in town who wouldn't spare you a crust of bread. There was an edge to his voice that spoke of witnessed cruelties and old angers. Ma'am, begging your pardon, but you were half dead when I found you. Whatever trouble brought you to that state, it's worse than any trouble you might cause me. He moved to the fireplace and ladled stew into a wooden bowl, the smell making Sarah's empty stomach growl audibly. When did you last eat? He asked, carrying the bowl to a small table near the bed. Sarah couldn't remember. Days, maybe. She'd been saving what little money she had for emergencies, not realizing that starvation itself was becoming the emergency. I can't pay you, she said quietly, shame coloring her words. Didn't ask you to. Ezra set the bowl within her reach and stepped back again. Eat. You're feeding more than yourself. The stew was the most delicious thing Sarah had tasted in months, rich with meat and vegetables that must have come from a garden behind the cabin. As she ate, she became aware of other details about her surroundings. The cabin was modest but comfortable, everything in its place and built to last. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, more books than most townhouses boasted. A rifle hung above the mantel, clean and well-maintained, but it was the small things that caught her attention. A woman's hairbrush on the washstand, though it looked unused. A delicate china cup among the practical earthenware, as if someone had once cared about pretty things. Your wife? Sarah asked, nodding toward the brush. Ezra's jaw tightened. Was. 3 winters passed. He turned away, but not before she caught the flash of old pain in his eyes. Fever took her and our boy. The simple words carried a weight of grief that Sarah recognized all too well. She'd lost people too, though her losses came from shame rather than sickness. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. They sat in silence for a while, 2 wounded souls sharing space without pretense. Outside, Sarah could hear the wind picking up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the roof. The sound reminded her that winter was coming, and winter in the mountains was no place for a woman about to give birth. I should leave before the snow comes, she said finally, though the thought terrified her. I won't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary. Ezra looked at her then, really looked, taking in her thin frame and the dark circles under her eyes. Snow's already started in the high passes, he said quietly. Won't be safe to travel for months. Besides, he added, his voice gruff with an emotion he was trying to hide, cabin gets lonely in the winter. Wouldn't mind the company. The first snow came 3 days later, fat flakes that drifted down like feathers and covered the world in pristine silence. Sarah stood at the window, watching the familiar landscape transform into something magical and treacherous, knowing that any chance of leaving was now months away. Behind her, she could hear Ezra moving around the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, banking the fire and checking the supplies he'd laid in for winter. We'll need more firewood, he said, though he'd been splitting logs for 2 days straight. Sarah suspected he was trying to fill the awkward silences that stretched between them, 2 strangers bound together by circumstance and the approaching storm. I can help, she offered, though they both knew her condition made heavy work impossible. Still, she'd been mending his clothes and preparing meals, small ways to justify her presence that mattered more to her pride than to his comfort. That evening, as wind howled around the cabin and snow piled against the windows, they sat before the fire sharing a supper of cornbread and preserved venison. The dancing flames cast shadows that made the cabin feel both intimate and vast, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of winter darkness. Sarah found herself studying Ezra's face in the firelight, noting the way grief had carved lines around his eyes and the careful distance he maintained even in the small space they shared. What was her name? She asked quietly. Your wife. Ezra's hands stilled on his cup of coffee. For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd crossed some invisible line drawn by his pain. Then he spoke, his voice soft as falling snow. Mary, Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, before she took my name. Prettiest girl in 3 counties, though she had a tongue sharp enough to cut timber when riled. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Always said she could tame any wild thing, including me. How did you meet? Her pa's farm bordered the land where I was logging. She used to bring lunch to the work crews, and she always had something smart to say about how we were cutting the trees or treating the animals. Ezra stared into the fire, lost in memories that were both painful and precious. One day she told me I was being cruel to my horse, working him too hard in the heat. When I told her it wasn't any of her business, she threw a whole bucket of water over both me and the horse, said we both needed cooling off. Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. What did you do? Stood there dripping and speechless while she marched off with her nose in the air. Spent the next 3 months finding excuses to work near her pa's farm, just hoping to catch another glimpse of her. Ezra's expression grew tender. She made me work for it, made me prove I was worth her time. Best thing that ever happened to me, winning Mary Hartwell's heart. The baby chose that moment to kick, a sharp jab that made Sarah gasp and press her hand to her side. Ezra's attention snapped to her, concern replacing the distant look of remembrance. You all right? Just active tonight, Sarah said, but she saw how Ezra's gaze lingered on her belly, and she recognized the expression that crossed his face. It was the same look she'd seen on her father's face when her mother had carried her younger brother, a mixture of wonder and protective instinct that had nothing to do with personal connection and everything to do with the miracle of life itself. Was it hard, she asked, losing them both? Ezra was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she'd pushed too far. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. Mary carried that baby 9 months, talking to him every night, making plans, sewing little clothes. When her time came, everything went wrong. The baby was turned sideways, and there was no doctor for 50 miles. I tried everything I knew, but… He stopped, his hands clenched into fists. Lost them both the same night. Been asking myself ever since what I could have done different. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, understanding now why Ezra had rescued her, why he'd been so careful and gentle despite his gruff exterior. It wasn't your fault, she said quietly. Sometimes things just go wrong, no matter how much we love someone or how hard we try to save them. Is that what happened to you? Ezra asked, his storm gray eyes meeting hers across the firelight. Something went wrong? Sarah looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of her own story pressing against her chest. She'd never told anyone the whole truth, had carried the shame and hurt alone for so many months that it felt strange to consider sharing it. But here, in this warm cabin with snow falling outside and a man who understood loss sitting across from her, the words came easier than she'd expected. His name was William Garrett, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He was the banker's son, educated back east, handsome as the devil himself. He courted me proper for 6 months, talked about marriage and the house we'd build, the children we'd have. Made me believe I was the luckiest girl alive. Her voice hardened. Soon as I told him about the baby, he was gone. Left town on the next stage. And his father made sure everyone knew I was nothing but a lying fortune hunter who tried to trap their precious boy with false claims. The days grew shorter and the nights colder as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Inside the cabin, something had shifted after that evening by the fire. The careful politeness between Sarah and Ezra had softened into something warmer, more natural. They moved around each other with the easy rhythm of people who'd found an unexpected harmony, sharing chores and meals, and the comfortable silences that spoke of growing trust. Sarah's belly had grown noticeably rounder, and with it came the reality that this child would be born in the wilderness, far from doctors or midwives or any of the comforts civilized women took for granted. The thought terrified her, but when she watched Ezra quietly preparing for that eventuality, some of her fear eased into grateful amazement. He'd begun carving a cradle from cedar wood, working on it by firelight after their evening meals. His hands, so large and weathered from years of hard living, moved with surprising delicacy, as he shaped the tiny bed. The design was simple but beautiful, with gentle curves that would rock a baby to sleep and protective sides that would keep small limbs safe. When Sarah had asked about it, Ezra had grunted something about having time to spare, but she'd seen the careful attention he paid to every detail, the way he sanded each piece until it was smooth as silk. "You don't have to do this," she'd told him one evening, watching him fit the pieces together with the patience of a master craftsman. "Baby needs somewhere to sleep," he'd replied, not looking up from his work. But Sarah had caught the tenderness in his voice, the way his fingers lingered on the wood as if he were blessing it. It wasn't just the cradle. Every day brought some new preparation that spoke of Ezra's determination to see both mother and child safely through the birth. He'd ridden to town twice in the past week, returning with supplies that must have cost him dearly. Clean white cloth for bandages, laudanum for pain, herbs that the old women swore by for difficult births. He'd even brought back a bottle of whiskey, not for drinking but for sterilizing, though he'd gruffly explained it could serve both purposes if needed. The trips to town weren't easy for him, Sarah realized. She'd seen how he braced himself before leaving, like a man preparing for battle. When he returned, his jaw would be tight with suppressed anger, and she knew he'd faced questions and suspicions from the townspeople who couldn't understand why the hermit mountain man was suddenly so concerned with women's needs. "They talk," he'd said one evening, his voice carefully neutral. "Ask questions about you, about what you're doing up here." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. "What do you tell them?" "Tell them it's none of their business." Ezra's tone left no room for argument. "But they're not going to stop wondering. Some of them think you're my woman, others think you're something worse." The words hung between them like smoke, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Sarah knew what people must be thinking, what assumptions they were making about a pregnant woman living alone with a bachelor in the wilderness. The same judgments that had driven her from town were following her even here, into this sanctuary Ezra had provided. "I could tell them the truth," she said quietly. "About William, about what really happened. Maybe then they'd understand." Ezra shook his head. "Truth doesn't matter to people who've already made up their minds. Besides, their opinion don't change what's happening here. You need help bringing that baby into the world, and I'm the only one around to give it." He was right, but the knowledge sat heavy on Sarah's heart. She'd brought her shame to this good man's doorstep, and now it was touching him too. The townspeople would remember his kindness to her, and some would count it against him. In trying to save her, he was risking his own reputation, his own peace. That night, as Ezra put the finishing touches on the tiny cradle, Sarah felt the baby move restlessly inside her. Soon, very soon, this child would need to find its way into the world, and their fate would rest in the hands of a man who'd already lost everything once. She watched his careful movements, the way he checked and rechecked every joint and surface, and felt something bloom in her chest that she'd thought she'd never feel again. Hope, fragile as new green leaves, but hope nonetheless. The blizzard struck with the fury of a living thing, howling down from the peaks like something wild and hungry. Sarah woke to the sound of wind battering the cabin walls and snow driving against the windows with such force it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry god. She lay still for a moment, listening to the storm's rage and feeling an answering restlessness in her belly that made her breath catch. "Ezra," she called softly, but there was no answer from his bedroll by the fire. A glance toward the window showed nothing but swirling white, a wall of snow so thick it seemed solid. When another sharp pain gripped her middle, stronger than the practiced pain she'd been feeling for days, Sarah knew with cold certainty that her time had come. The cabin door burst open, bringing with it a whirlwind of snow and the figure of Ezra, bent nearly double against the wind. He'd been checking the animals in the small shelter he'd built behind the cabin, making sure they had enough feed and water to weather the storm. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows, and his clothes were white with snow that steamed as it met the cabin's warmth. "Worst storm I've seen in 5 years," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "Good thing we laid in supplies when we did. We'll be snowed in for days." He looked up then and saw something in Sarah's face that made him go very still. "What is it?" "The baby." Sarah managed, her hand pressed to her side where another contraction was building. I think it's time. For a moment, Ezra looked like a man who'd been struck by lightning. His face went pale beneath the windburn, and Sarah saw the flash of old terror in his eyes, the memory of another birth, another storm, another woman he'd been unable to save. Then something shifted in his expression, a hardening of resolve that reminded her why she'd felt safe with this man from the very beginning. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the fear she'd glimpsed. "All right, we can do this." He moved with sudden purpose, banking the fire higher and pulling out the supplies he'd gathered for this moment. Clean cloths, the bottle of whiskey, herbs for tea that was supposed to ease labor pains. "How long have the pains been coming?" "Since I woke up. They're getting stronger." Sarah tried to keep the fear out of her voice, but she could hear it anyway, high and thin like the wind outside. Ezra knelt beside the bed, his hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit up. "Mary used to say babies come when they're ready, storm or no storm. Said they're tougher than we give them credit for." He was talking as much to himself as to her, Sarah realized, drawing strength from his wife's memory. "First thing we need to do is get you comfortable and time the pains. See how fast things are moving." The next few hours passed in a haze of increasing pain and growing intensity. Ezra proved himself a steady, calming presence, timing contractions with his pocket watch and offering sips of herbal tea between the worst of them. He'd rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands thoroughly, approaching the situation with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. "Tell me about the cradle," Sarah gasped during a brief respite between contractions. The pain was getting worse, coming faster, and she needed something to focus on besides the fear that clawed at her chest. "Cedar's a good wood for babies," Ezra said, understanding what she needed. "Repels insects, smells sweet. My pa made my cradle from cedar, and his pa before that. Figure this little one deserves the same." His voice was calm, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather instead of bringing new life into the world during the worst blizzard in years. "What if something goes wrong?" The words escaped before Sarah could stop them, voicing the terror that had been building with each contraction. Ezra's hands stilled on the cloth he'd been folding. When he looked at her, his eyes held the weight of his own losses, but also something stronger, something that refused to bend. "Then we'll face it together. But nothing's going wrong, you hear me? This baby's going to be fine, and so are you. I won't let anything happen to either of you." Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, cutting them off from the world as completely as if they were the only two people left alive. But inside the cabin, by the light of the fire and the steady glow of oil lamps, two people who'd found each other in their darkest moments prepared to welcome new life into the world. And for the first time in months, Sarah believed that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The first cry pierced the storm's fury like a bell, clear and strong and utterly alive. Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and shaking, but the sound of her daughter's voice filled her with a joy so fierce it took her breath away. Through the haze of pain and relief, she watched Ezra cradle the tiny, red-faced bundle with hands that trembled despite their steadiness throughout the long labor. "She's perfect," he whispered, and Sarah heard wonder in his voice, as if he'd forgotten that miracles were possible. The baby was indeed perfect, small but healthy, with a cap of dark hair and lungs that proclaimed her displeasure at being thrust from her warm haven into the cold world. Ezra wrapped her carefully in one of the soft cloths he'd prepared, his movements gentle and sure. "Let me see her," Sarah managed, her arms aching to hold the child she'd carried for so many months through fear and uncertainty. When Ezra placed the baby in her arms, Sarah felt something break open in her chest, a flood of love so overwhelming it made everything else fade away. The storm, the pain, the long months of shame and rejection, none of it mattered now. She had her daughter, alive and healthy and more beautiful than any dream. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist with one finger. "I'm your mama. We made it, didn't we? We both made it." Ezra stood quietly beside the bed, watching mother and child with an expression Sarah had never seen before. The grief that usually shadowed his features had lifted, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. When the baby opened her eyes, dark and unfocused but undeniably alert, he made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. Mary always said babies were proof that God hadn't given up on the world, he said softly. Looking at her, I think maybe Mary was right. The storm had begun to ease sometime during the night, the howling wind settling to a steady whisper that no longer shook the cabin walls. Snow still fell, but gently now, like a blessing instead of a curse. Inside their warm sanctuary, the new family settled into the rhythm of first hours, learning each other's needs and responses. Sarah discovered that motherhood came with instincts she hadn't known she possessed. Her body knew how to nourish her child, her arms knew how to soothe her cries, and her heart expanded to hold a love bigger than anything she'd ever imagined. The baby, who'd been so restless in the womb during the final weeks, seemed content now to sleep against her mother's chest, lulled by the familiar heartbeat she'd known for 9 months. Ezra proved as devoted to the baby as he'd been to Sarah's welfare. He kept the fire burning bright and warm, prepared nourishing broths to help Sarah regain her strength, and took his turns walking the floor when the baby fussed. Watching him hold the tiny girl, singing old songs in his rough baritone, or simply talking to her about the world she'd entered, Sarah felt her heart swell with gratitude and something deeper, something that scared her with its intensity. She needs a name, Ezra said on the second day, as he rocked the baby while Sarah rested. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. Sarah had been thinking about names throughout her pregnancy, but none of the possibilities she'd considered seemed right now that she could see her daughter's face. Emma, she said suddenly, the name rising from somewhere deep in her heart. Emma rose. Emma, Ezra repeated, and the baby seemed to turn toward the sound of his voice. Emma Rose Fletcher. That's a strong name for a strong girl. But even as they celebrated the miracle of new life, reality pressed at the edges of their cocoon of happiness. The baby's cries, carried on the mountain air, might have been heard by other inhabitants of the high country. Trappers, hunters, men who might ask questions about a woman and child living with the hermit of Pine Ridge. Word had a way of traveling in the mountains, passed along with supplies and gossip until it reached ears that might not welcome the news. That evening, as Sarah nursed her daughter by firelight and Ezra cleaned and oiled his rifle with more attention than usual, they both heard it. The distant sound of horses moving through snow, still far off, but unmistakably heading in their direction. Ezra's hands stilled on the weapon, and Sarah instinctively drew the baby closer to her chest. Could be anyone, Ezra said quietly, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. Travelers looking for shelter, maybe. Sarah nodded, but her heart was already racing. She'd known this peace couldn't last forever, that the world would eventually intrude on the sanctuary they'd built. Looking down at her sleeping daughter, she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. Whatever came, whoever was riding toward their cabin through the snow, she would not let them take away what she'd found here. Not the safety, not the belonging, and certainly not the man who'd given her both. The riders came at dawn, their horses dark shapes against the pristine snow. Sarah watched through the cabin window as 4 men approached, recognizing with a sick feeling in her stomach the lead figure's familiar posture and expensive coat. Thomas Garrett, William's older brother, rode with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his way in all things. Behind him came 2 of his father's hired men and someone Sarah didn't recognize, a thin man with the hard look of someone who solved problems with violence when words failed. "Stay inside with the baby," Ezra said quietly, checking his rifle one final time. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Sarah wanted to protest, to tell him she wouldn't hide while he faced danger for her sake. But Emma chose that moment to wake with a soft cry that reminded them both what was truly at stake. She gathered her daughter close and moved away from the window, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. Thomas Garrett's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air as the riders pulled up in front of the cabin. "Stone, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that doesn't belong to you." Ezra opened the door slowly, his rifle held casually but ready. "Morning, Garrett. You're a long way from your daddy's bank. What brings you to my mountain?" "Don't play games with me, mountain man." Thomas dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, but his eyes were hard as winter stone. "We've come for the woman and the bastard she's carrying. She's going to face justice for the lies she told about my brother." "Woman's given birth already," Ezra said, his voice level despite the tension Sarah could see in his shoulders. "3 days ago, matter of fact. And she's not going anywhere." The thin stranger laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mighty protective of your whore, ain't you, Stone? Word in town is you've been playing house up here, taking another man's leavings and calling it charity." Sarah saw Ezra's hands tighten on the rifle, but his voice remained calm. "I'd be careful with that kind of talk if I were you. Mountains got a way of swallowing men who don't watch their tongues." Thomas stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "My brother's reputation has been damaged by that woman's lies. She's going to come back to town and confess the truth, that she seduced an innocent boy and tried to trap him with false claims of pregnancy. The bastard will be placed in a foundling home where it belongs." "Over my dead body," Ezra said, and there was something in his tone that made even the hired guns shift nervously in their saddles. "That can be arranged," the thin man said, but Thomas held up a hand. "No need for bloodshed if everyone's reasonable. Stone, you've got a reputation as a decent man, despite your peculiar ways. Surely you can see that harboring a fallen woman and her bastard child brings nothing but trouble. Hand her over, and we'll forget you were ever involved." From inside the cabin, Sarah could hear every word, and each one cut like a knife. They'd come to take her baby, to brand her daughter a bastard and consign her to an institution where children were more likely to die than thrive. The thought of Emma in some cold, loveless place filled Sarah with a rage so pure it took her breath away. "The lady and her child are under my protection," Ezra said, his words carrying across the clearing like a declaration of war. "Anyone who wants to take them will have to go through me first." Thomas's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Stone. My family has influence in this territory. Cross us, and you'll find life up here a lot less comfortable than it used to be." "Your family's influence don't reach this far into the mountains," Ezra replied. "And I've been uncomfortable before. Survived it just fine." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, for armed men facing one. But Sarah knew better than to count Ezra out. He knew these mountains like other men knew their own backyards, and his reputation as a marksman was legendary throughout the territory. Still, the odds were 4-1, and if violence broke out, there was no guarantee that right would triumph over numbers. "This isn't over, Stone," Thomas said finally, remounting his horse. "The woman has to face justice eventually. She can't hide behind your guns forever." "Maybe not forever," Ezra agreed, "but long enough." As the riders turned to leave, the thin stranger called back over his shoulder, "Enjoy your winter, mountain man. Spring's got a way of changing things, bringing all sorts of unpleasant surprises down from the high country." Sarah watched through the window until the riders disappeared into the trees, their threat hanging in the air like smoke. When Ezra finally came back inside, she saw that his hands were shaking slightly, the after-effect of controlled rage and barely avoided violence. "They'll be back," she said quietly, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the danger that had just passed so close. "I know." Ezra set his rifle aside and moved to stoke the fire, but Sarah could see the tension still coiled in his shoulders. "But not until spring, and a lot can happen between now and then." Sarah looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt her resolve harden like steel in a forge. These men thought they could take her child, destroy her happiness, punish her for loving the wrong man. They were about to discover just how fiercely a mother could fight when everything she loved was threatened. Spring came early to the mountains that year, melting the snow in rushing torrents that filled the creek and turned the world green almost overnight. With the warmer weather came visitors, more than Ezra's isolated cabin had seen in all his years of solitude. Word had spread through the settlements about the hermit who'd taken in a fallen woman and helped deliver her child, and people came out of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, surprising support. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife from Cedar Ridge, arrived on a warm April morning with a basket of baby clothes and a determined expression. Sarah had braced herself for judgment and condemnation, but instead found herself embraced by a woman who'd lost 3 children of her own and understood the precious nature of new life. That baby's a blessing, no matter the circumstances of her birth, Mrs. Henderson declared, holding Emma with practiced ease while Sarah prepared coffee. Anyone who says different hasn't read their Bible closely enough. Other women followed, drawn by curiosity but won over by the sight of a healthy, happy child and a mother who glowed with contentment despite her unconventional situation. They brought gifts, advice, and most importantly, acceptance that began to chip away at the wall of shame Sarah had carried for so long. But it was Dr. Morrison's visit that changed everything. The elderly physician had ridden up from the valley settlement, ostensibly to check on mother and child, but really to satisfy his own curiosity about the mountain hermit's sudden domesticity. What he found surprised him. "This is some of the finest midwifery I've ever seen," he told Ezra after examining both Sarah and Emma. "Clean birth, no complications, healthy mother and child. Where did you learn such skills?" Ezra's face reddened slightly. "Mary, my wife, she had a way with birthing animals. Taught me some things before she passed. Figured people couldn't be too different." Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "You've got a gift, Stone. These mountains need someone with your skills. I've been thinking about retiring, and there's not another doctor within 50 miles. You ever consider taking up healing as more than just a necessity?" The idea hung in the air between them like a bridge to a different future. Sarah saw something shift in Ezra's expression, a possibility he'd never considered opening before him. For a man who'd retreated from the world after losing his family, the thought of dedicating his life to preserving life held a powerful appeal. Their peaceful spring was shattered when Thomas Garrett returned, this time with a larger group and the territorial marshal in tow. Sarah's heart sank when she saw the official badge glinting in the afternoon sun, knowing that Ezra's protection might not extend to defying federal authority. "Marshal Dawson," Ezra said carefully as the group approached, "what brings law enforcement to my mountain?" The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, dismounted slowly. "Got complaints about a kidnapping, Stone. Serious allegations about a woman being held against her will." Thomas Garrett's smile was sharp as a blade. "The woman belongs in town, facing justice for her lies. The child should be in proper care, not raised by savages in the wilderness." Sarah stepped out of the cabin then, Emma in her arms and her chin raised with quiet dignity. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, finding her courage in the love that surrounded her. "Marshal Dawson, I'm Sarah Fletcher. No one's holding me here against my will." The marshal's eyes took in the scene before him, the well-maintained cabin, the healthy baby, the woman who showed no signs of distress or coercion. "Ma'am, these men claim you've made false accusations against William Garrett, that you're trying to damage his reputation with lies about fathering your child." "The only lie told was by William himself," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear. "When he promised to marry me, when he said he loved me, when he swore the child I carried was precious to him. The truth is in Emma's face, Marshal. She has her father's eyes and his stubborn chin. Anyone who looks can see it." Dr. Morrison stepped forward then, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. "Marshal, I've examined this child. Based on her development and the mother's account of conception, there's no question about the timing. This baby was conceived when and where Sarah Fletcher claims." The marshal turned to Thomas Garrett, whose face had gone pale. "You got any proof these accusations are false, beyond your brother's word?" Thomas sputtered, but before he could answer, another voice joined the conversation. Mrs. Henderson had returned with several other women from town, drawn by news of the confrontation. "Marshal, I've known the Garrett family for years. William's not the first girl he's charmed and abandoned. just the first one brave enough to name him publicly. That's a lie, Thomas shouted, but his protest was drowned out by murmurs of agreement from the gathered women. Is it? Asked Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher. What about Jenny Mills, who left town so sudden last year? Or Mary Beth Collins, who married that rancher from Colorado so fast it made heads spin? The marshal held up his hand for silence. Miss Fletcher, what exactly do you want from this situation? Sarah looked at the man who'd given her sanctuary, who'd delivered her child, and protected them both with his life. She saw the future Dr. Morrison had offered them, a chance to build something meaningful together. I want to raise my daughter in peace, Marshal. I want to be left alone to live my life as I choose. And if that life includes this man. The marshal nodded toward Ezra. Then that's my choice to make, Sarah said firmly. Ezra Stone is a good man who's shown me more kindness and respect than I ever received from those who claim to be civilized. The marshal studied the faces around him, the protective stance of the mountain man, the determined expression of the young mother, the supportive presence of the townswomen who'd ridden up to stand with her. I don't see any crime here, he said finally. Woman's got a right to choose where she lives and who she lives with, long as she's not being coerced. Thomas Garrett's face twisted with rage. This isn't over. My family won't let this stand. Your family's influence ends at the county line, the marshal replied calmly. And I suspect it's not as strong as you think it is, even there. As the defeated group rode away, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just acceptance, but the promise of a future built on truth and love rather than shame and fear. She looked at Ezra, saw the wonder in his eyes as he realized what they'd accomplished together, and knew that whatever came next, they'd face it as a family. 2 years later, the cabin in the clearing looked nothing like the solitary hermit's refuge it had once been. A garden bloomed where only wild grass had grown before, neat rows of vegetables and herbs that Sarah tended with the same careful attention Ezra brought to his woodworking. A small addition had been built onto the original structure, creating space for the family that had grown not just in love, but in purpose. Emma Rose Stone, for she had taken Ezra's name along with his heart, tottered around the garden on sturdy legs, babbling in the way of children who know themselves beloved. At nearly 2, she had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady temperament, though Sarah still insisted she had William Garrett's stubborn chin. The resemblance mattered less now than the love that surrounded the child like a warm blanket. Ezra had indeed taken up Dr. Morrison's suggestion about healing work, and their cabin had become an unofficial medical station for the scattered settlements throughout the mountain region. He'd proven as gifted with people as he was with animals, his gentle hands and quiet manner soothing fears as effectively as his growing knowledge treated ailments. The money wasn't much, but it was honest work that brought meaning to their days and gratitude from their neighbors. Sarah had found her own calling in the process, assisting with births and caring for new mothers with an instinctive skill that amazed even Dr. Morrison during his occasional visits. Women who might once have shunned her now sought her help, drawn by her gentle manner and the wisdom born of her own struggles. She'd delivered 7 babies in the past year, and each successful birth felt like a small victory against the cruelties that had once defined her life. "Mama, a flower," Emma announced proudly, holding up a dandelion she'd picked from the meadow. In her eyes, it was as precious as any rose, and Sarah treated it accordingly, placing it carefully in a small jar of water on the kitchen table. "Beautiful flower from my beautiful girl," Sarah said, sweeping Emma up for a hug that made the child giggle with delight. "What do you say we pick some more for Papa?" Ezra was working in his shop, the sound of his hammer ringing across the clearing as he shaped wood into something useful and beautiful. He'd expanded beyond furniture into medical instruments and devices that Dr. Morrison had described, but that were difficult to obtain in the frontier territories. His reputation as a craftsman had spread along with his fame as a healer, bringing steady work and the respect of men who might once have dismissed him as an eccentric hermit. The sound of approaching horses made Sarah look up from her gardening, but without the fear that had once accompanied such visits. These days, most visitors came seeking help rather than bringing trouble. She was surprised to see Marshall Dawson riding into the clearing, his expression serious but not unkind. "Afternoon, Mrs. Stone," he said, dismounting and tipping his hat politely. The title still sounded strange to Sarah's ears, though she and Ezra had been married by circuit preacher the previous spring in a ceremony attended by half the mountain folk within 50 miles. "Marshall, what brings you our way?" Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, automatically checking to make sure Emma was safely within reach. "Got some news you folks might be interested in," Dawson said as Ezra emerged from his workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands. "William Garrett's been arrested down in Denver. Seems he got caught cheating at cards and pulled a gun when he was called on it. Shot a man, though not fatally, thank the Lord." Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions at the news. Once, she might have felt vindicated to learn that the man who'd abandoned her had fallen so low. Now, she mostly felt sad for the waste of a life that might have been different with better choices. "What's that mean for us?" Ezra asked, his arm moving protectively around Sarah's shoulders. "Means the Garrett family's got bigger problems than pursuing old grudges," Dawson replied. "Thomas has his hands full trying to keep his brother from hanging, and their father's reputation has taken a considerable hit. I don't think you'll be hearing from them again." The news should have brought relief, but Sarah realized she no longer needed it. The fear and shame that had once defined her existence had been replaced by something stronger, built on the foundation of genuine love and earned respect. Whatever the Garretts did or didn't do could no longer touch the life she'd built here in the mountains. "There's something else," the marshal continued. "Dr. Morrison's officially retiring next month, and he's recommended Ezra to take over his practice in the valley. It's a real position, with a real salary and a house in town." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A real medical practice, recognition of Ezra's skills, a chance for Emma to grow up around other children and attend proper school. Everything a mother could want for her family's future. But when she looked at Ezra, she saw the same conflict in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. This mountain, this cabin, this clearing where they'd found each other and built their love, had become more than just a home. It was their sanctuary, their proof that broken things could be made whole again. "It's a generous offer," Ezra said carefully, "but I reckon we've got all we need right here. These mountains still need someone to tend their hurts, and this seems like as good a place as any to do it." Marshall Dawson smiled, as if he'd expected that answer. "Morrison said you'd probably say that. He's making arrangements to supply you with proper medical equipment and training. Seems you'll be the official Mountain District physician, whether you have a fancy office or not." As the marshal rode away, Sarah stood with her husband and daughter in the garden they'd planted together, watching the sun set behind the peaks that had sheltered their love. Emma played at their feet, secure in the knowledge that she was cherished and protected. The cedar cradle Ezra had carved with such loving care now sat in their bedroom, waiting for the next child they hoped would join their family. "No regrets?" Ezra asked softly, his arms encircling both his wife and daughter. Sarah leaned back against his solid warmth, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. She thought of the frightened, desperate woman who'd collapsed by Willow Creek 2 years ago, and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. "None," she whispered. "None at all." In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the rising moon, and Sarah smiled. Once, that sound might have filled her with terror. Now it simply meant she was home, in the place where broken hearts learned to heal and lost souls found their way to love. The town had said she'd die giving birth alone, but they'd been wrong about everything. She hadn't died, she hadn't been alone, and the life she'd found was more beautiful than any dream she'd dared to imagine. Thank you so much for joining me on Sarah and Ezra's incredible journey from despair to hope, from loneliness to love. If this story of resilience and second chances moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales of the human spirit tomorrow. These stories remind us that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments, and that love truly can conquer all.